Part 1. Catherine de Medici, the Poison Queen of France. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're floating back to the 16th century. So, dim the lights, grab your tea, or your antidote of choice, and let's gently wander into the life of one of Europe's most misunderstood and probably most feared royal figures, Catherine de Medici, the so-called Poison Queen of France. Now, was she actually sprinkling arsenic into her enemy's soup? Maybe. Was she unfairly blamed for half the bad things that happened in France for 50 years? Also maybe. The truth is, Catherine was complicated. She was the product of one of Europe's most dramatic families, the Medici, those Renaissance bankers who somehow decided money and art weren't enough and they needed royal blood too. And oh boy, did they get it. So, let's drift back to 1519, Florence, Italy, a city that smells like olive oil, power, and questionable political alliances. Catherine was born into a family that had already made enemies of just about everyone. Her father, Lorenzo II de Medici, was the Duke of Urbino, which sounds fancy, but he was really more of a Medici mascot. Flashy title, not much substance. He died when Catherine was only a few weeks old. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman, also died almost immediately after childbirth. So baby Catherine was officially an orphan before she could blink. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, the rest of her extended family started fighting over who got to raise her. Because in Renaissance Italy, custody battles weren't about love, they were about influence. She was, after all, the last legitimate Medici heir of her branch. People were already looking at her like a walking bank vault with a pulse. Eventually, her care fell to her uncle, Pope Clement VII. Yep, Catherine's babysitter was literally the Pope, which sounds like a sitcom setup, but in reality, it meant she spent her childhood bouncing between convents. Clement was busy dealing with, the entire Reformation. So Catherine was stashed away with nuns, sometimes for safety, sometimes as a hostage. And during one of Florence's many violent rebellions, little Catherine found herself barricaded inside a convent while angry mobs outside were shouting for her head. She was 11, not exactly your typical childhood sleepover. Still, Catherine grew up calm, quiet, and dangerously observant. The kind of kid who watches everyone else first and speaks last, which in Renaissance politics was a survival skill. When she was 14, Pope Clement decided to marry her off. Because why let a teenager enjoy her cloistered peace when she could be used to cement an alliance with France? The chosen groom was Henry, the Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. Not the heir, not the charming one, but the spare. And if you're thinking that this marriage will somehow lead to emotional stability, congratulations, you've never read about French royalty. Catherine arrived in France in 1533, a small Italian girl with big eyes and even bigger expectations on her shoulders. The French court was elegant, dangerous, and about as welcoming to her as a cat is to a new dog. They saw her as foreign, strange, and, worst of all, a Medici. To the French nobles, that meant she was practically middle class despite her wealth. Her husband, Henry, was quiet, moody, and completely uninterested in her. Why? Because he was already obsessed with another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a widow 20 years older than him. Yep, Catherine's new husband's mistress was old enough to be her mother, and he was head over heels for her. The weird part? Catherine didn't rage about it. She didn't throw fits or send assassins. She just watched, learned, and waited. Because Catherine was patient in the way only people trained by nuns and surrounded by politics could be. She understood that in royal life, you didn't need to win right away. You just needed to outlast everyone else. And oh, did she ever. For the first 10 years of her marriage, she was in a terrible position. She couldn't produce children, a literal crisis for a queen. The court whispered that she was barren. Some suggested curses, others suggested witchcraft, because of course they did. And Diane de Poitiers, she wasn't helping. She encouraged Henry to stay away from his wife, while still managing to dictate what Catherine should wear. She even chose Catherine's jewels, as if rubbing salt into the wound wasn't enough. But Catherine eventually did what Renaissance women were expected to do. She delivered heirs. 10 of them, to be exact. Because when Catherine committed to something, she really committed. 3 of those sons would go on to become kings of France, which is either impressive or horrifying, depending on how you feel about French dynastic politics. Now, you'd think that producing a small army of royal children would earn her some respect, but no, the French still looked down on her as that Italian woman. Meanwhile, Henry continued mooning over Diane, giving her royal properties, and even letting her sign official documents. Catherine, outwardly calm, inwardly simmering, started learning how to play long-term politics. She surrounded herself with astrologers, scholars, and, if you believe the rumors, poisoners. Whether that last part was true or not, we'll get to later, but the reputation stuck. Catherine became known for her love of astrology, alchemy, and mysterious little bottles of things that smelled just slightly too herbal. Then, in 1559, everything changed. Henry II, her husband, died in one of the most poetic and ridiculous ways imaginable. He was jousting at a tournament because apparently nothing says midlife crisis than pretending you're a medieval knight. A splintered lance pierced his eye and brain. He lingered for 10 days in agony, while Catherine banned anyone from seeing him except herself and a few doctors. When he finally died, Diane de Poitiers was banished, her jewels confiscated, and Catherine, finally, was in charge. At 40 years old, she became the Queen Mother of France and regent for her 15-year-old son, Francis I. And this is when the Poison Queen truly emerged. She had spent decades being dismissed as quiet, plain, and foreign. But suddenly, she was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, and France at that moment was a hot mess. The country was tearing itself apart between Catholics and Protestants. The nobles were plotting, the peasants were rioting, and every royal cousin thought they deserved the crown more than her teenage son. So, Catherine did what any rational Italian matriarch would do. She started micromanaging everyone. Courtiers, generals, religious leaders, no one escaped her web of control. She smiled, hosted endless banquets, and quietly gathered information on everyone. Her favorite weapon wasn't poison, it was information. Still, people loved a good scary story, and Catherine's interest in astrology and her Italian origins made her an easy target. Rumors spread that she kept a cabinet of poisons in the Louvre, that her gloves were laced with deadly powders, and that she killed rivals with perfume. Was any of it true? Probably not. But if you're going to be blamed for everything anyway, you might as well enjoy the mystique. Let's float gently here for a moment. Because Catherine's story is only just warming up. Her first son's reign would collapse faster than his teenage immune system. And the real chaos, religious wars, arranged marriages gone wrong, and yes, a little bloodshed, was still ahead.
Part 2. Catherine's Sons and the French Wars of Religion. Welcome back, night owls. If you're still awake, and somehow not poisoned by royal intrigue, let's gently glide into the second act of Catherine de Medici's long, exhausting soap opera of a life. When we last left her, Henry II was dead, Diane de Poitiers was finally out of the picture, and Catherine was now the most powerful widow in France. The throne had passed to her oldest surviving son, Francis I, who was 15, fragile, and married to Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman who had more dynastic drama in her pinky finger than most families manage in a century. So yes, things were about to get complicated. Catherine wasn't technically supposed to rule. She was just the Queen Mother, but Francis was too weak, both physically and politically, to do much of anything. Unfortunately, his in-laws, the powerful Guise family, had other ideas. The Guises were devout Catholics with the ambition of Roman emperors, and they saw Francis as their puppet. They wanted to use him, and by extension Mary, to control France. Catherine quickly realized that if she didn't play her cards carefully, she'd end up being quietly sidelined, or worse, retired in a convenient monastery. So she did what Catherine did best. She smiled, played nice, and watched everyone like a hawk disguised as a nun. The real problem wasn't just court politics. It was religion. France at the time was splitting apart between Catholics and Protestants, known locally as the Huguenots. The Protestants were growing in number and influence, and the Catholics, well, let's say, not thrilled about it. Tensions were already simmering when Catherine took power, but they soon reached boiling point. Now the Guises, Mary's uncles, saw Protestants as literal heretics who needed to be burned, exiled, or ideally both. Meanwhile, Catherine leaned toward moderation. She didn't particularly care who worshipped how, she just wanted peace. But moderation doesn't sell well in 16th century France. Then, in 1560, a group of Protestant nobles tried to kidnap Francis II in what became known as the Amboise Conspiracy. The plot failed, and the Guises responded by massacring the rebels. The Loire River reportedly ran red with blood. Catherine was horrified, not because she was squeamish, but because she knew every drop spilled would make reconciliation impossible. And then, before she could even try to clean up the mess, Francis II died. At 16. Ear infection, abscess in the brain? Take your pick. Just like that, Catherine's first king was gone. The Guises lost their grip on power, Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent packing back to Scotland, and Catherine was left with her second son, Charles IX, a boy of 10, terrified and clinging to his mother's hand at the coronation. This time, Catherine made sure she was officially in charge. She became regent of France, and for the first time ruled openly. Now, Catherine's regency started with optimism. She hosted peace conferences, issued the Edict of Saint-Germain to grant limited tolerance to Protestants, and even staged symbolic gestures of reconciliation. But, of course, this is France, and tolerance didn't go down well with the extremists on either side. The next decade would become one long nightmare of civil wars, betrayals, and religious fanatics shouting at each other across burning cities. And through it all, Catherine floated in the middle, sometimes trying to calm things, sometimes fanning the flames just enough to keep either side from winning completely. It was less rule by conviction and more rule by chaos management. But Catherine wasn't just a political figure. She was also a mother, and her children, bless them, were each their own kind of disaster. Charles IX, for instance, was sweet as a child, but as he grew older, he became unstable. He idolized his mother but was haunted by guilt and paranoia. Catherine saw it happening and tried to guide him, but she also may have contributed to his stress levels by keeping him constantly entangled in political crises. Her third son, Henry, would become the favorite, the beautiful, moody, fashion-loving one who could charm everyone in a room and then immediately alienate them with his ego. The youngest, Francis, Duke of Alençon, was rebellious and ambitious, and somehow managed to be both ignored and irritating at the same time. So yes, a real dream team. Meanwhile, France's wars of religion raged on. In 1562, the Duke of Guise's men massacred Protestant worshippers at Vassy, and that was basically the match that set the country on fire. Armies formed, cities switched hands, and Catherine's carefully balanced diplomacy fell apart. For years, she traveled across France trying to make peace. Imagine her, a middle-aged widow constantly on the road in heavy gowns, negotiating between generals, bishops, and rebellious nobles, all while trying to keep her teenage son from collapsing emotionally. At one point, she even met with Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant leader Catherine had worked so hard to win over. She tried to win him over, not because she liked him, but because she needed someone to calm the Huguenots down. Catherine wasn't loyal to either side. She was loyal to survival. By 1570, she seemed to have achieved a fragile truce, and in typical royal fashion, she decided to seal it with a marriage. Her daughter, Margaret of Valois, Margot for short, was to marry the Protestant prince Henry of Navarre. It would be the union of Catholic and Protestant bloodlines, a symbol of peace and unity. You can already tell this is going to end terribly. The wedding was set for August 1572 in Paris, the city filled with nobles from both sides, uneasy smiles and forced politeness everywhere. Catherine seemed delighted. The bride looked radiant. The groom probably looked terrified. Then, just days after the wedding, someone tried to assassinate Admiral Coligny, the Protestant leader Catherine had worked so hard to win over. He survived, barely, but the Huguenots were furious. They suspected the Catholic faction, or maybe even Catherine herself. And that's when things spiraled. In the early hours of August 24, 1572, the bells of Saint Germain de l'Auxerrois rang out, and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began. Catholic mobs, apparently with royal approval, or at least no royal disapproval, started slaughtering Protestants throughout Paris. The violence spread to other cities, and for weeks France was soaked in blood. How much of this was Catherine's doing? Historians still argue about it. Some say she ordered the killings to eliminate Protestant leaders and protect her son. Others think she lost control of events entirely. Catherine herself, characteristically, said little and looked composed even as Europe gasped in horror. Charles IX, on the other hand, was shattered. The young king had nightmares, hallucinations, and fits of remorse. He reportedly said, "What blood, what murders, what evil counsel have I followed?" before coughing up blood, literally and metaphorically, until he died in 1574, at the age of 23. Another son gone, another crown to pass. And so Catherine's favorite, Henry, became king, Henry III of France, the last of the Valois line. Catherine was 55 years old now, but she was still the backbone of the monarchy. Henry was flamboyant, vain, and more interested in his wardrobe and personal entourage, the infamous minions, than in ruling a divided kingdom. Catherine, patient as ever, became her advisor, mother, and occasionally therapist. She negotiated truces, arranged alliances, and tried to keep her son from alienating absolutely everyone. But Henry's reign was doomed from the start. The wars of religion reignited again and again. The ultra-Catholic League despised him for being too tolerant. The Protestants distrusted him completely. Catherine spent her last years traveling across France, still negotiating, still exhausted. And let's be honest, by then she was done. She had outlived almost everyone who had ever underestimated her. Popes, kings, rivals, even Diane de Poitiers. Catherine survived them all. When she died in 1589 at the age of 69, France was still in chaos. Her son Henry III would be assassinated just months later, and her son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, would eventually take the throne as Henry IV, founding the Bourbon dynasty. So, in a strange, poetic twist, Catherine, the Italian orphan who arrived in France unwanted, became the matriarch of a line that would rule for another 2 centuries. As for her Poison Queen reputation, it stuck. People preferred to imagine her mixing potions in secret rooms.
Part 3. The Medici Legacy and the Myths of the Poison Queen. Hey there. Still awake? Or maybe you're half asleep, and just letting the words drift by. Perfect. Because tonight, we're not diving into battles or court drama anymore. Those are done. Now we're floating through the echo that Catherine de Medici left behind. The legend, the ghost, the whispers that followed her long after her black-veiled figure disappeared from the halls of the Louvre. Catherine's death in 1589 should have been the end of her story. She'd survived wars, rebellions, betrayals, and about 14 too many family funerals. But in a way, her real afterlife began after her death, because that's when France decided to turn her into something bigger, darker, and much, much weirder. See, Catherine wasn't just remembered as a queen or regent, she became a myth. The Poison Queen, the Black Widow of the Valois, the woman who supposedly kept drawers full of deadly perfumes and whose palace corridors were lined with secret poison cabinets. If 16th century France had tabloids, she would have been on the cover every week. So where did it all come from? Let's drift back one more time to her favorite obsession, knowledge. Catherine was fascinated by astrology, alchemy, and medicine, which, in Renaissance Europe, was basically the holy trinity of things that make you look suspicious. She surrounded herself with Italian scholars, apothecaries, and astrologers. The most famous of them was Nostradamus. Yes, that Nostradamus, the prophet of doom who wrote vague predictions that people still misinterpret 500 years later. She invited him to court, asked him to read her children's horoscopes, and apparently believed at least some of what he said. Nostradamus, in turn, supposedly predicted that all 3 of her sons would be kings, which technically came true. Not that any of them had particularly long or happy reigns, but points for accuracy, I guess. This connection between Catherine and prophecy made her seem mystical, mysterious, otherworldly. And as with all powerful women who didn't smile enough, it made people deeply uncomfortable. The stories got darker from there. Some said she kept a cabinet full of poisons disguised as cosmetics. Others swore she wore gloves lined with toxic substances to kill enemies by a handshake. Yes, the infamous poison gloves. It's not confirmed, but in fairness, if anyone was going to invent deadly fashion accessories, it would probably be Catherine. Her palace, the Château de Chenonceau, also played into the legend. After Henry II's death, Catherine took it over from Diane de Poitiers, the mistress she had tolerated for 20 years, and turned it into her sanctuary. The chateau stretched across the river Cher, elegant and serene, but according to rumor, Catherine filled it with secret rooms, laboratories, and astrologers muttering over cauldrons. Reality check? She mostly used it for banquets, hunting parties, and government business. But, government meetings don't make for good ghost stories. And people loved ghost stories. By the 17th century, when the Bourbons were ruling France, Catherine's image had already solidified into the archetype of the evil queen. She became the go-to villainess in every play, pamphlet, and gossip chronicle. Need someone to blame for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre? Catherine. Political assassination? Catherine. Slightly weird dream involving snakes and perfume bottles? Probably Catherine. It didn't help that France was trying to move on from the chaos of the wars of religion, and Catherine's memory made an easy scapegoat. Oh, all that bloodshed? That was because of her witchcraft. Sure. Definitely not because of decades of religious fanaticism and aristocracy's egos. Even her Italianness became part of the slander. The French had long seen Italians as cunning and dangerous. a stereotype that was basically Renaissance racism with a better vocabulary. Catherine's Florentine heritage meant she was seen as untrustworthy, Machiavellian, and capable of anything. Which is funny because she actually read Machiavelli's The Prince, and, judging by her policies, probably agreed with about 90% of it. Now, let's take a quiet detour into her descendants, because the Medici blood didn't stop with her. It flowed quietly through Europe's royal veins for centuries, spreading like a expensive, slightly toxic perfume. Catherine's daughter Margaret of Valois, the one who married Henry of Navarre, became queen consort to the future Henry IV of France, the first Bourbon king. Their marriage, as you might remember, was the one that started with a massacre. It didn't improve much afterwards. Henry spent most of his time with mistresses, while Margot became the patron saint of dysfunctional relationships. But through their union, Catherine's lineage merged into the Bourbon dynasty, which would rule France until, well, the guillotine happened. Catherine's other descendants scattered throughout Europe. Through arranged marriages and tangled family trees, her bloodline touched Spain, Austria, and even Britain. That means, technically, Catherine de Medici is a distant ancestor of modern European royals. So if you've ever looked at a stiff royal portrait and thought, they look a little scheming, well, maybe that's just the Medici genes shining through. Let's float for a moment to how Catherine's reputation evolved over time. During the Enlightenment, writers like Voltaire and Diderot used her as a cautionary tale about tyranny, superstition, and female ambition. She was the anti-heroine of rational thought, emotional, manipulative, foreign. The very traits polite society loved to condemn in women, especially powerful ones. Then came the Romantics in the 19th century, and they loved her. To them, Catherine was Gothic, tragic, and fascinating, a dark mother figure haunting the corridors of history. Alexander Dumas wrote La Reine Margot, turning her into a full-blown villain, scheming, cruel, always a step away from murder. Audiences devoured it. She became less a historical figure and more melodramatic symbol, half queen, half witch. By the time cinema came along, the myth was fully baked. Films, TV shows, and novels portrayed her as everything from a cold manipulator to a literal poisoner stirring vials in candlelight. It doesn't help that the nickname Poison Queen is just too catchy to resist. But when you peel away the legend, the truth is far less theatrical and far more impressive. Catherine was not France's destroyer. She was its preserver. She kept the monarchy afloat for 30 years of religious wars that would have shattered any lesser ruler. She didn't create the chaos. She just refused to drown in it. She was pragmatic to the bone. When others shouted, "God wills it," Catherine whispered, "Let's be realistic." And while the men around her dueled and preached, she managed to hold a collapsing state together with little more than charm, cunning, and endless patience. There's a certain irony that she was called the Poison Queen, when in truth, she was constantly trying to neutralize the poisons that others poured into France: fanaticism, greed, and pride. But she didn't make it easy for historians to defend her. Her coldness, her control, her willingness to make moral compromises, all of that made her seem alien, even monstrous. But as she herself might have said, better monstrous and alive than virtuous and dead. Let's take a slower breath here. Imagine Catherine in her final years, sitting in her study at Blois. She's dressed, as always, in black. Her once bright eyes are duller now, but still calculating. Around her, The kingdom she fought to preserve is cracking again. Her son, Henry III, is fighting rebels. The Catholic League is rising, and the air smells faintly of candle wax and dust. Outside her window, the Loire River glides by, silent, steady, unconcerned with the chaos of kings and queens. She must have looked at it often, that water, constant and cold. Maybe she saw herself in it, always moving, always reflecting the storms above, but never breaking. She died quietly, surrounded.
Part 4. Catherine's Ghost. How Modern Culture Reinvented the Poison Queen. Hey again, Night Wanderer. If you're still here, still listening through the slow hum of history, you've made it all the way to the end. Tonight, let's not talk about Catherine de Medici, the queen, or the politician, or the mother, but about Catherine the ghost, the one who lingers, the one history just refuses to let go of. Because if you think her story ended in 1589, you'd be mistaken. Catherine never really left France. She just changed form, from flesh and blood to myth and memory, drifting through books, paintings, and television screens like a faint whiff of poisonous perfume that refuses to fade. Let's ease into this last stretch slowly. Picture the old palaces, Louvre, Chenonceau, Blois, empty now, the fires long gone cold. The corridors where her footsteps once echoed are silent, but people swear they still feel her there. And in a way, they're right. Catherine became an idea, a symbol of female power, wrapped in fear and fascination. The 17th century saw her ghost rise first in whispers and pamphlets. She was the perfect scapegoat for everything wrong with France's bloody past. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre? Her fault. The decline of the Valois dynasty? Also her fault. Bad weather? Probably her fault too. The people who came after her, especially the Bourbon kings, were eager to shift the blame. It's easier to say the wicked queen did it than we, as a nation, are a chaotic mess. By the 18th century, Enlightenment writers polished her legend into something elegant and sinister. Voltaire called her cruel, Diderot called her superstitious, and later historians, mostly men, called her manipulative, cold, unfeeling. The irony, of course, is that they also praised male rulers who did exactly the same things. When kings used cunning, it was wisdom. When Catherine did, it was poison. Let's just say sexism didn't skip the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment either. But Catherine didn't really become Catherine the icon until the 19th century. That's when writers and artists in love with Gothic melodrama resurrected her with flair. Alexandre Dumas made her the scheming villain of La Reine Margot, a dark puppet master orchestrating blood and betrayal. Painters showed her in black gowns, pale-faced and jewel-draped, holding vials or daggers. The image stuck, part queen, part witch. And it didn't stop there. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Catherine's ghost glides right into modern media. She became a staple of historical fiction, always lurking behind some trembling young monarch. In movies, she's usually the one in the corner of the candlelit throne room, whispering dangerous advice with a knowing smile. Cold, mysterious, maybe plotting your death, or maybe just making tea. Hard to say. One of the most famous modern portrayals came from the film adaptations of La Reine Margot, where she's depicted as a calculating matriarch, manipulating everyone in sight. And honestly, even when she's villainous, she steals the show. Because deep down, everyone loves a woman who refuses to play nice in a world designed to crush her. Then came the TV era, and Catherine got her full, dramatic makeover. The show Reign turned her into something between a scheming mother, a court comedian, and a tragic anti-hero. Megan Follows, the actress who played her, gave her bite and humor, the sharp, weary wit of someone who's seen too much and survived anyway. It wasn't historically accurate, of course, but it felt right. Because at her core, Catherine is a character who belongs to every age.
Every generation rediscovers her, repackages her, and argues over whether she was evil or brilliant. And that's the beauty of her ghost. She adapts. You can find her now not just in books and shows, but in pop culture shorthand. The Poison Queen archetype pops up everywhere, from Game of Thrones' Cersei Lannister to historical dramas about palace intrigue. A powerful, intelligent woman surrounded by men who underestimate her. She's not kind, she's not gentle, but she's the reason the kingdom still functions while everyone else loses their heads. Sound familiar? Yeah. Catherine walked so half of TV's royal anti-heroes could run. Even in fashion, her influence lingers. Black lace, pearl chokers, severe collars, gold embroidery, all reminiscent of her mourning style. She turned widowhood into an aesthetic centuries before goth culture made it cool. If modern editors ever did a Renaissance Vogue issue, she'd be the cover model, glaring softly over a goblet of something ominously purple. But beyond all the aesthetics and accusations, there's something deeper about why we keep bringing her back. It's not just the poison myths or the court scandals. It's the idea of control. Catherine represents what it looks like when a woman refuses to be powerless in a world built to silence her. She didn't rebel, she maneuvered. She didn't shout, she watched. And that, somehow, was more terrifying to people than any sword or potion could ever be. Let's take a quiet step back and look at her world compared to ours. Catherine lived in a time when queens were supposed to smile, produce heirs, and stay decorative. She did all that, and then ran a kingdom in her spare time. She was a master of compromise, a survivor of every regime shift, and a strategist who played men like chess pieces. If she'd been born a century later, she might have been a general, a CEO, a political genius with a Twitter account. Instead, she became a ghost, a legend distilled into perfume and ink. Even today, historians keep trying to redeem her. There are books with titles like Catherine de Medici, the Hidden Queen, or Catherine, the Woman Behind the Poison. They argue she was misunderstood, that she was pragmatic, not cruel, that she saved France from collapse rather than causing it. And honestly, they're right. But part of Catherine's magic is that you never really know. The truth and the myth have fused so tightly that separating them feels wrong somehow. Because if she wasn't the Poison Queen, what would she be? Just another widow in black trying to keep her sons alive. The myth is more interesting, and Catherine, ever the showwoman, would have understood that. She spent her life crafting appearances. She knew that power and image are the same thing. Maybe, in her own way, she made sure the legend would outlive her. Let's end where all ghost stories should. Back at Chenonceau. It's quiet there now. The galleries stretch over the water like a bridge between centuries. Visitors wander through her rooms, peering at portraits and faded tapestries. They say sometimes, late at night, you can see her. Catherine, dressed in mourning black, standing at a window, looking down at the river. Not sad, not angry, just watching. Maybe she's making sure France hasn't destroyed itself again. Maybe she's counting her descendants on European thrones. Or maybe she's just amused, watching us debate, dramatize, and misunderstand her for the 500th time in a row. Because that's the secret of Catherine's ghost. You can't exorcise her. Every time someone calls a woman ambitious, ruthless, or calculating with that certain tone of fear, Catherine's spirit quietly stirs. Every time someone says, she's too powerful, she smiles. The Poison Queen never needed poison to last this long. She just needed time. And that's where we close our story. Catherine de Medici, the orphan who ruled France, the widow who reshaped Europe, and the ghost who still walks through our imagination. So if your room is dark right now, and the candlelight flickers just a little too much, don't worry. It's probably just a draft. Or maybe it's the faint rustle of a silk gown, centuries old, moving quietly past. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, history always keeps its ghosts.